My name is Claire Bennett, and I was 34 years old when my grandfather's entire life was quietly handed to the man who had never respected it. My grandfather, Henry Bennett, built Bennett Feed and Grain from nothing. He bought the land acre by acre, raised a family in the farmhouse behind the store, and spent more than 50 years helping people who could not always afford to pay him on time. He died on a Tuesday. By Friday, my father stood on the farmhouse porch, smiled in front of our relatives, and told me I would not inherit a single cent. He made one mistake. He forgot who had kept my grandfather's books for 23 years. And the night after the funeral, a woman I had never met appeared outside my apartment carrying an envelope. What was inside would expose a stolen will, forged land documents, and a betrayal my father thought no one would ever discover. Welcome to Truth Drama Tales, where hidden betrayals come into the light and the quiet ones finally get their chance to speak. Before everything fell apart, there was a brass bell above a wooden door and the smell of grain dust floating through the air. Bennett Feed and Grain stood at the edge of a small Ohio town. I practically grew up behind its counter. I was 9 when Grandpa Henry first allowed me to ring up a customer. I was 11 when he placed his old green ledger in front of me and handed me a ballpoint pen. "The numbers are yours," he said. My grandfather had rough hands and an incredible memory, but he trusted written records more than either. Every bag of feed, every unpaid account, and every dollar that came through the store went into that ledger. He never stood over me because he expected a mistake. He stood there because he enjoyed watching me get it right. Some farmers owed him money for months. A few owed him for years. Grandpa rarely chased them, but he always knew exactly what the owed. Once I asked why he wrote everything down when he remembered every number anyway. He placed his coffee beside the register and looked at me seriously. "The books don't lie, Claire," he said. "People do." I thought it was simply something old men said. I remembered it anyway. While I worked beside Grandpa, my father, Richard Bennett, kept his distance from the store. He claimed Grandpa never gave him enough authority. Grandpa said Richard wanted ownership without responsibility. My younger brother, Ethan, came and went whenever he needed money or another fresh start. I stayed. For 23 years, I knew every sound the building made. I knew which floorboard creaked near the storage room and how the brass bell sounded different during winter. Then Grandpa became sick. The store grew quiet. The ledger went into a drawer, and our family began waiting for the moment no one wanted to discuss. He passed away in late September. 3 days later, a stranger walked into our lives, and nothing in our family was ever the same again. The funeral was small, but half the county attended. People came because Grandpa Henry had helped them. Some remembered feed purchased on credit. Others remembered the winter he had delayed their payments without charging interest. My father moved around the church basement, accepting condolences like a politician collecting votes. During those conversations, he repeatedly used one word: estate. Grandpa's estate. The estate property. The estate business. But every time Richard said it, he sounded as though the estate already belonged to him. The following morning, I found him in Grandpa's kitchen. He had the farmhouse keys in his pocket and a lawyer's business card beside his coffee. "When will the will be read?" I asked. Richard never looked up. "There is no will." I stared at him. "Grandpa made one." "No, he didn't." "I drove him to the lawyer's office 6 years ago." That finally made him look at me. 6 years earlier, Grandpa had asked me to take him to the county seat. I remembered the office clearly. I had waited outside while he signed a thick stack of documents in front of an attorney and a gray-haired notary. When Grandpa returned, he folded his glasses and said he had finally put his affairs in order. "I watched him sign it," I told my father. "I was there." Richard slowly placed his cup on the table. Grief plays tricks on people's memories. I'm not imagining it. His expression hardened. "You were sitting in a waiting room, Claire. You don't know what he signed." He walked away before I could answer. The screen door slammed behind him. 2 days later, Richard called the family together on the farmhouse porch. Our cousins, aunts, and several neighbors were still in town after the funeral. My father stood on the top step, exactly where Grandpa used to stand during family gatherings. He announced that Henry Bennett had died without a will. Because Richard was Grandpa's only surviving child, he would apply to become administrator of the estate. He spoke as though the court's decision had already been made. He said the store, farmhouse, and 200 acres would fall under his control. Then he looked directly at me. "You won't get a single cent," he said. "Ethan is the next heir." A few relatives laughed nervously. Ethan stared at the ground. My father waited for me to cry, argue, or embarrass myself. I did none of those things. I nodded, walked past him, and entered the farmhouse. That silence confused him more than any outburst could have. I collected my purse from the hallway table and drove 9 miles back to my apartment. Then I did what I had always done whenever something did not make sense. I wrote everything down. My family had always mistaken my silence for obedience. Whenever a difficult form needed completing, I handled it. When my mother died, I arranged the documents. When Ethan wrecked his truck at 19, I dealt with the insurance company, Wessit. And the store's tax filings were due. I spent my Sundays preparing them without asking for payment. I told myself I was helping the family. Somewhere along the way, my help became an expectation. Claire handles things. Claire does not complain. Claire never asks for anything. Sitting at my kitchen table that night, I realized I had spent my entire life keeping everyone else's accounts without ever entering my own name in the ledger. There was something else my father had forgotten. I worked as a probate paralegal. For 7 years, I had helped attorneys manage estates, inventories, court petitions, and contested wills. I knew administrators did not simply take whatever they wanted. They had legal duties. They had to disclose assets, report transactions, and protect the interests of lawful heirs. I opened a fresh legal pad. At the top of the page, I wrote, "Questions." Underneath it, I wrote my first one. If there is truly no will, why is Richard behaving like an owner instead of an administrator? On Monday, I visited the county courthouse during lunch. Probate filings were public records. I requested the case my father had opened. The paperwork confirmed part of his story. Richard had filed a petition asking to be appointed administrator of the intestate estate of Henry Bennett. His lawyer was Victor Crane, an attorney I recognized from several unpleasant cases at our firm. The petition listed the store, the farmhouse, and 3 parcels of farmland. Every asset appeared undervalued. It also listed Richard as Grandpa's only legal heir. That was the difficult part. Under state law, if Grandpa truly died without a will, his estate would pass to his only surviving child, Richard. Not Ethan. Not me. The law did not allow grandchildren to inherit around a living parent. My father had lied when he called Ethan the next heir, but he was not lying when he said I would receive nothing. If the will had disappeared, everything could legally pass to him. That was when I understood. The law was not his mistake. It was his protection. Crane's petition also requested independent administration with minimal court supervision. That meant fewer approvals and less oversight, while Richard controlled the assets. He had filed the documents only days after Grandpa's death, far too quickly for a grieving son who supposedly knew nothing about the estate. I copied every page. Then I prepared a formal written request for a full inventory and accounting of all estate transactions. The letter was polite and professional. I sent it by certified mail to Victor Crane and kept a copy. I was not accusing anyone. I was turning on the lights. 4 days later, Crane responded. He did not provide an inventory. Instead, he accused me of causing distress to a grieving family. He described my request as harassment and warned that any further interference would be documented. No asset list, no account balances, no explanation, just a threat wrapped in polite language. I had learned something from years of probate work. People with nothing to hide normally provide the paperwork. People who stall are usually hiding what the paperwork contains. The following weekend, Ethan arrived at my apartment carrying a grocery store pie. My brother was 29, 4 years younger than me. He had always been charming, impulsive, and convinced that his next business idea would make him wealthy. His landscaping company had recently failed. He had a newborn child, unpaid bills, and the exhausted appearance of a man who had not slept properly in months. "Dad says you're trying to drag Grandpa's name through court," he said. I led him inside. We sat at the kitchen table while I cut the pie. Ethan explained that Richard wanted to keep the business in the family. He said Grandpa would have preferred a man running the store. Every sentence sounded exactly like something our father would say. I realized Ethan had been sent to pressure me. Instead of arguing, I placed the courthouse documents in front of him. "Did you read what you signed?" His fork stopped. "What are you talking about?" I pointed to his signature. He had signed a statement supporting Richard's appointment as administrator and waiving his right to object. Ethan stared at the page. "Dad said it was routine." "You signed it without reading it?" "He told me where to sign." His face went pale. That was the moment I stopped viewing Ethan as my father's partner. He was another person Richard had manipulated. A tired young father had been handed a stack of legal papers and told to trust the man holding the pen. I asked Ethan whether he had signed anything else. He hesitated. Then he admitted Richard had given him several documents and promised that the property would eventually come to him. Ethan had no copies. After he left, I wrote another question on my legal pad. What exactly did Richard promise Ethan and why? Crane continued refusing my requests. Each letter was courteous. Each one said nothing. While he delayed, I began reconstructing Grandpa's finances. For 23 years, I had recorded store income, farm rent, expenses, and customer accounts. I knew approximately what the business earned. I knew what the farmland generated. I knew Grandpa had accounts at the bank on Main Street. Using old receipts, tax records, and bank slips still stored in my apartment, I created a shadow inventory of what the estate should contain. My calculations showed a valuable estate. Richard had described it as nearly empty. Both things could not be true. I searched through the folder of records I had brought home during Grandpa's illness. Among the papers were 2 property transfers I had never seen before. 4 months before Grandpa died, 2 parcels of farmland had supposedly been sold to a company called Blackstone Agricultural Holdings. The sale price was less than 1/3 of the land's fair value. Then I examined Grandpa's signature. I had watched him sign his name thousands of times. His capital H began with a heavy downward stroke. Even as his hands became unsteady, that movement remained firm. The signature on the deed was too careful, too smooth. The hand was steady at a time when Grandpa's medication made his fingers shake. It was a reasonable imitation, but it was not his signature. I searched the state business registry. Blackstone Agricultural Holdings had been formed only months earlier. The registered agent was linked to another company, which was linked to a mailing address owned by my father. Richard had sold Grandpa's land to himself. Before I could decide what to do with that discovery, my father called. His voice was warm. He called me kiddo, a word he had not used in years. He said the family was being torn apart and Grandpa would have hated to see us fighting. Then he explained what he wanted. He had prepared a family settlement agreement. If I signed it, I would waive any present or future claim against the estate. "Sign it and we can put this ugliness behind us," he said. I heard his wife, Linda, speaking in the background. A moment later, she took the phone. "Think about Ethan's baby," she said. "Do you really want to take food away from a newborn because of your pride?" That was their strategy. They were not asking me to ignore fraud. They were accusing me of harming a child by asking questions. A year earlier, the guilt might have worked, but I had watched too many grieving families use the same tactic. I kept my voice calm. "I'll need a few days to read it." My father relaxed. He believed my caution meant I was afraid. After the call, I placed the unsigned agreement beside the suspicious deeds. He thought he was buying my silence. Instead, he had confirmed that he needed it. The forged deeds proved motive, but I still needed Grandpa's will. I remembered the attorney's name, Samuel Green. I drove to his former office the following Saturday. The brick building was empty, For lease sign hung in the window. A real estate agent told me Samuel Green had died 2 years earlier. His practice had closed, and the client files had supposedly been distributed or transferred. No one knew where Grandpa's file had gone. I contacted the County Bar Association, the Records Department, and several attorneys who had worked with Green. Nothing. Without the original will, I faced a serious legal problem. When a will was last known to be in the deceased person's possession and could not be found after death, the court could presume the person had destroyed it intentionally. In other words, the missing document could be treated as a revoked will. My father would not have to admit he destroyed anything. The absence of the document could work in his favor. I drove home after dark, feeling defeated for the first time. When I entered the parking lot, an elderly woman was waiting outside my apartment. She wore a sensible coat and stood beneath the security light with patient determination. "Are you Claire Bennett?" she asked. I kept my keys between my fingers. Yes. Henry Bennett's granddaughter? Yes. The one who kept his books? That stopped me. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Ellis. For 31 years, she had worked as Samuel Green's secretary and notary. She was the gray-haired woman I had seen stamping Grandpa's papers 6 years earlier. Margaret had read Grandpa's obituary. Days later, she noticed a probate announcement saying his estate was being handled as though he had died without a will. She knew that was not true. She had watched him sign one. "I haven't slept properly since I saw that notice," she said. "Some things have to be carried to the right person." Then she reached into her coat and handed me a worn envelope. "It's time they remembered who you are." I invited her inside. At my kitchen table, I opened the envelope. 3 items fell out. The first was a conformed photocopy of the last will and testament of Henry Bennett. Every page contained Grandpa's initials. The signatures were clear. I read the document twice. Grandpa had left Bennett feed and grain in the farmhouse jointly to Ethan and me. The farmland was to be divided between us, with a fair cash inheritance reserved for Richard. My father had not been disinherited, but he had not been given control. Grandpa wanted the business and property protected by the 2 grandchildren who had grown up around it. The second item was a copy of Margaret's notary journal. It recorded the date, document title, Grandpa's signature, and the official seal. The third was an index card containing the name Thomas Reed and an old telephone number. Thomas had been the second witness. He had worked at the feed store for decades. I held the will and felt something inside me shift. My father had tried to convince me that Grandpa had forgotten me. The document proved the opposite. Margaret touched the envelope. "A copy helps," she said, "but it is not the original." "I know. You'll have to prove Henry did not destroy the original himself." That was the burden. To admit a lost will, we would need to prove that it had been properly executed, establish its exact contents, and overcome the presumption that Grandpa had revoked it. Margaret could prove the execution. The photocopy could establish the contents, but I still needed evidence showing someone else had access to the original and a reason to remove it. I needed to connect my father to the missing document. The telephone number for Thomas Reed no longer worked. I searched property records, voter records, and public databases. Eventually, I found that he had moved to Illinois to live near his daughter. 9 days later, I drove across 2 states and found him in a small ranch house with a flag near the porch. Thomas was 81 years old. His knees were weak, but his eyes were sharp. The moment I mentioned the Bennett family, he became caught. "Ias, I'm not getting involved in family trouble." I did not pressure him. I simply showed him the copied will and Margaret's notary record. His expression changed. He lowered himself into a porch chair and slowly read each page. "I remember this," he said. He told me Grandpa had bought everyone lunch after the signing. During that meal, Grandpa had looked through the office window toward the parking lot, where I was waiting in the car. "He pointed toward you," Thomas said. "He told me, 'That girl keeps the real books.' He sounded prouder of that than anything else he owned." I had to look away. Then I asked the question that mattered. "If the court calls you, will you testify?" Thomas studied me for a long moment. "For Henry," he said. I will. Someone must have seen me return from the trip, because my father quickly learned I had found evidence. The following Sunday, he gathered the family at the farmhouse. By the time I arrived, Richard was already telling everyone that I had invented a fake will to steal Ethan's inheritance. He said I had found an old woman willing to lie for me. He accused me of being jealous and bitter. Several relatives believed him because he spoke with the confidence of a man who had never expected to be challenged. I could have revealed the forged deed. I could have shouted that he was stealing Grandpa's estate. But I knew what would happen. I would become the emotional daughter attacking her grieving father, so I waited until the room became quiet. Then I picked up my purse. "If the will is fake," I said, "you won't mind the court examining it." For the first time, his expression changed. Only for a second, but I saw it. The following morning, I hired Elena Morales, an experienced probate attorney. I understood the paperwork, but I was not foolish enough to represent myself in the biggest fight of my life. We filed a petition asking the court to admit Grandpa's lost will. We attached the copy, Margaret's notary record, and Thomas Reed's sworn statement. At the same time, we filed a motion to compel Richard to provide a full estate inventory and accounting. Victor Crane could ignore my letters. He could not ignore a judge. Judge Rebecca Mercer granted our motion and ordered Richard to produce the records within 21 days. Crane looked furious. Their entire strategy depended on keeping the numbers hidden. Now the numbers had a deadline. The accounting arrived on the final day. It was hundreds of pages long. Crane had probably hoped the volume would hide the wrongdoing. He had forgotten who would be reading it. I cleared my kitchen table, made coffee, and started reviewing every entry. The first major violation appeared within an hour. Blackstone Agricultural Holdings was listed as the purchaser of Grandpa's land. Corporate records proved my father controlled the company. Richard had used his authority over the estate to transfer valuable property to himself for a fraction of its true value. It was self-dealing, one of the clearest breaches of fiduciary duty an administrator could commit. Then I found inflated administrative fees. Richard had charged the estate far more than a reasonable administrator would receive. Crane's legal fees had also been paid from estate funds, even though much of his work involved protecting Richard personally. The store's insurance had been allowed to lapse. Estate money had paid for repairs to my father's private property. Every page revealed another piece of Grandpa's life being quietly converted into Richard's personal wealth. That was when I understood the purpose of his announcement on the porch. Ethan had never been the chosen heir. My brother was only a shield. Richard knew relatives might object if he admitted the land was coming directly to him, so he claimed he was protecting a struggling young father with a newborn child. No one wanted to question that story. Behind the store, he was transferring everything into Blackstone Agricultural Holdings. The property had never been intended for Ethan. It was intended for Richard. I prepared a detailed exhibit. For every suspicious transaction, I recorded the accounting page, the amount involved, and the legal duty that had been violated. When I finished, the betrayal was no longer an accusation. It was a column of numbers. Ethan arrived at my apartment after dark. This time, he carried nothing. He sat on the front step and stared across the parking lot. "I signed more documents," he said. "I know." Dad said I would receive the property after everything was settled. He said you were already being taken care of. I brought the accounting outside and placed it between us. I showed him the Blackstone transfer. I showed him the low sale price. I showed him the money taken from the estate. Ethan read in silence. When he finally looked at me, his face had collapsed. "If this is true, what does that make me?" I did not excuse him, but I did not blame him for everything either. "It makes you someone he used," I said. "The difference is what you do now that you know." I left the documents with him. Crane soon filed a motion asking the court to dismiss our lost will petition. His argument focused on our greatest weakness. The original will had not been found. A photocopy and witnesses could prove that the will once existed, but they could not automatically prove Grandpa had not destroyed it himself. Elena explained the situation plainly. "We can prove the will was signed," she said. "We can prove what it said. We can prove Richard had a financial motive, but we still cannot prove he had access to the original. Without that link, we could lose." I thought about where Grandpa kept important papers. Then I remembered the old floor safe in the farmhouse office. He kept property deeds, military papers, and family documents inside it. If the original will had remained in his possession, it would have been in that safe. But Richard controlled the farmhouse. I could not legally enter and search it. Instead, I began calling local locksmiths. The third locksmith remembered the Bennett farmhouse. He had been hired to drill open the floor safe and replace its lock. The customer was Richard Bennett. The work had been completed 11 days after Grandpa's funeral. 11 days. My father had gained exclusive access to the farmhouse, opened the safe, and then replaced the lock so no one else could check what remained inside. The locksmith still had the signed work order. I called Elena immediately. "That is our access evidence," she said. "That connects him to the place where the original was kept." We subpoenaed the work order. Margaret agreed to bring her original notary journal. Thomas prepared to testify. Elena arranged the accounting records, forged deed evidence, and corporate documents into organized exhibits. The night before the hearing, Margaret visited my apartment. She brought cookies and sat across from me at the kitchen table. "Speak plainly," she said. "Do not decorate the truth. Let the papers shout so you don't have to." I wrote her advice at the top of my notes. The courthouse hallway was crowded on the morning of the hearing. Our aunts sat together on one bench. Cousins avoided looking at me. Several retired store employees had also come. Richard stood near the courtroom doors wearing his best suit. Victor Crane was beside him. When my father saw me, he raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Still chasing your fairy tale?" I did not respond. Under one arm, I carried our evidence folder. In my other hand, I held Grandpa's green ledger. It was not evidence. I brought it because I needed something of his with me. Ethan stood apart from our father. For the first time in my life, he looked like someone preparing to make his own decision. The bailiff called the case. Judge Mercer entered and looked over the crowded courtroom. "Let us hear from the petition. Here's witnesses," she said. Margaret testified first. Elena asked about her 31 years as a legal secretary and notary. Margaret produced her original journal and read the entry from the day Grandpa signed his will, the date, the document title, his signature, her seal. Crane tried to suggest she could not accurately remember one appointment from 6 years earlier. Margaret looked at him calmly. "I do not have to rely on memory," she said. "I recorded it. That is why notary journals exist." A quiet laugh moved through the gallery. Crane asked whether the document might have been something other than a will. Margaret pointed toward the written entry. "It says last will and testament. I do not guess when using an official seal." Crane sat down. Then Thomas Reed entered the courtroom. He walked slowly to the witness stand and took the oath. He described working for Grandpa Henry, attending the signing and eating lunch with him afterward. He identified the copied will. He remembered Grandpa explaining that the store and farmhouse would go to Ethan and me jointly, while Richard would receive a cash share. Then Elena asked whether Grandpa had said anything memorable that day. Thomas looked toward me. He pointed through the office window toward Claire, he said. "He told me that girl keeps the real books." He said it like it was the proudest thing he owned. The courtroom became completely silent. Crane tried to question Thomas's memory because of his age. Thomas shrugged. "I'm 81, he said. "I'm old, not dishonest. I have protected 2 things in my life, my word and Henry Bennett's trust. I'm here because of both." Even Judge Mercer almost smiled. Margaret and Thomas had established that the will existed and had been properly signed. Now we had to prove Grandpa had not revoked it. Elena called me to the stand. I carried the thin folder with me, the locksmith. As work order was admitted first. It showed that Richard had ordered the farmhouse safe drilled open and the lock replaced 11 days after Grandpa's funeral. I explained that Grandpa stored his most important documents inside that safe. Richard was the only family member controlling the farmhouse after Grandpa died. Then we presented the Blackstone deed. Corporate records showed Richard's connection to the company. The land had been transferred for approximately 1/3 of its value. Next came the accounting. I explained each transaction without raising my voice. Inflated fees, estate funds spent on private expenses, insurance allowed to lapse, legal bills charged against Grandpa's assets, property transferred to a company controlled by the administrator. Every page showed motive. Every signature showed control. When I reached the final entry, I placed Grandpa's green ledger on the witness rail. I looked at my father. "Grandpa taught me that the books don't lie," I said. "People do. This is the account you forgot someone would check." Richard jumped from his chair. "She is twisting everything," he shouted. Judge Mercer ordered him to sit. He ignored her. "She always thought she was better than us. That land should have been mine." Crane grabbed his arm, but Richard pulled away. "I spent my life waiting for that old man to treat me like his son," he shouted. "I only fixed what should have been mine in the first place." The courtroom froze. Crane closed his eyes. My father had just admitted that he had fixed an estate plan he claimed never existed. Judge Mercer leaned forward. "Sit down, Mr. Bennett." Richard finally noticed the bailiff moving toward him. He returned to his chair. His face was red, and his breathing was heavy. I said nothing. I did not need to. For months, Richard had described me as an emotional daughter inventing a fake will. Now the court had a notary journal, 2 witnesses, a locksmith's work order, suspicious deeds, corporate records, and an accounting filled with self-dealing. Then Ethan stood. I can sked the judge for permission to speak. His voice shook as he explained that he had signed documents without reading them because Richard told him they were routine. He admitted that he had believed he would inherit the property. Then he looked toward our father. "I do not want anything that comes from a forged deed or a missing will, Monsieur," he said. He formally withdrew his support for Richard's appointment as administrator. It was the first time I had ever seen Ethan oppose our father publicly. Judge Mercer called a short recess. When she returned, she delivered her ruling from the bench. She found that Grandpa's will had been properly executed. Margaret's journal and testimony established the signing. Thomas's testimony and the conformed copy established the contents. She also found that the presumption of revocation had been overcome. The will had likely been stored in the farmhouse safe. Richard gained exclusive control of the property after Grandpa died. He ordered the safe drilled open and changed the lock 11 days later. His subsequent conduct, including the land transfers and concealment of financial information, was inconsistent with an innocent loss. Judge Mercer admitted Henry Bennett's lost will to probate. She removed Richard as administrator immediately. She ordered him to repay the estate for the undervalued land transfers, improper fees, and personal expenses. The forged deeds and missing will were referred to the county prosecutor for investigation. Crane's billing practices were also referred to the state bar. Grandpa's wishes were finally recognized. The aftermath was quieter than people expect. There were no cheers outside the courtroom, no dramatic celebration. There was only relief. Bennett feed and grain, the farmhouse and the farmland passed to Ethan and me as Grandpa intended. Richard received the fair cash inheritance written into the will. Nothing more. Blackstone Agricultural Holdings was forced to return the land to the estate. Whether criminal charges will eventually be filed remains uncertain. Several relatives called me afterward. They apologized for believing Richard. I accepted their apologies, but acceptance did not mean forgetting. Accountability and bitterness are not the same thing. You can release anger without handing the same person another key. On the first Saturday in November, I reopened Bennett Feed and Grain. I swept the floor, oiled the door hinges, and returned the green ledger to its place behind the counter. When I unlocked the front door, the brass bell rang above me. For the first time since Grandpa's death, it sounded like home. Ethan now manages the storage yard and deliveries. The crisis changed him. He is steadier, more careful, and no longer willing to sign anything he has not read. When we signed our partnership agreement, I gave him one condition. "The books stay honest," I said. "Otherwise, you stay out." He nodded. No excuses, no argument. Our family is smaller now. It is also more truthful. The doors between Ethan and me remain open, but we both understand that trust should have boundaries. My grandfather was right. The books do not lie. Neither should the people responsible for keeping them. It took me 34 years, one stolen estate, and a courtroom filled with relatives to understand something important. Being the quiet person in a family does not make you weak. Sometimes the quiet person is the only one listening closely enough to hear the lie. My father believed silence meant surrender. He forgot that while he was speaking, I was recording every number. And in the end, one old ledger told the truth louder than he ever could. This is Truth Drama Tales. If this story reminded you to read before signing, locate your family's important documents, or question someone who refuses to show the accounts, do it before the paperwork disappears. Subscribe for more stories where betrayal is exposed, truth gets its day in court, and the quiet ones finally get heard.